This is Lessons Learned, and I'm your host, Matt Kennard, CEO of Better Lesson. Join me as we dig in with visionary state and district level leaders who share our mission to support every K-12 educator in developing the next generation of resourceful, compassionate, and resilient learners. Lessons Learned is brought to you by Better Lesson. Let's get started. Lessons Learned Season 2, a Better Lesson podcast. And listen, folks, today's a special one, especially for those of us who have grown up in the world of professional learning, thought about coaching. We have a guest today that has spent 20 years studying instructional coaching so students can experience better learning and better lives. He's been a keynote speaker at several conferences, including TLC, and led coaching workshops internationally. He's authored or co-authored over 10 books, including Instructional Coaching, Focus on Teaching, Data Rules, and Unmistakable Impact. He's a research associate at the University of Kansas Center for Research on Learning, and will slip a rock chalk Jayhawk in there when you are least suspecting it. This is the founder and senior partner of Instructional Coaching Group, Jim Knight, a legend in our field. Welcome to the show.
University of Kansas, the home of college basketball. The first coach was James Naismith. He's the only losing coach in the history of the great University of Kansas basketball team, and buried in Lawrence, Kansas. Roy Williams used to go on a jog, and he'd jog by Naismith's gravesite every time he went jogging.
A fair point. I'm a Massachusetts man myself, so Springfield, Mass is also the home of basketball. So I'll just, I'll throw it out there that Rock Chalk Jayhawk, if you want to root for a team that'll slightly underperform, except for giving us Paul Pierce, then there you go.
Well, you heard of Dean Smith. He was the University of Kansas grad. What's the stadium in Kentucky? Their coach, the famous coach, he was a University of Kansas grad.
Arthur Rupp.
Yeah, Adolph Rupp came from the University of Kansas. So it all starts in Kansas. That's my take anyway. But,
Well, I am smart enough to know that this is, when you get a diehard Kansas fan on, you're going to lose that debate.
They put a chip in your brain when you go there. So that's what happened.
Well, welcome to the show. We are so excited to have you. And for those of us who have been in the world of professional learning, particularly those of us who have been in the world of coaching, your impact has been unmistakable. At Better Lesson, we've modeled a lot of our work around coaching, instructional coaching, around the work you've done. So I'm going to start with just a sincere thank you to you for all you've done in the field.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. Well, listen, we've been talking a lot in season 2 of the podcast around what does it mean to think about post-secondary ready students, right? And not just students who got into college, but they're ready to persist, not just kids who went down a CTE pathway, but can really carve out productive lives for themselves. And we're really of the belief that professional learning is one of the core implementation pieces to making that a reality. But it all has to be measured in terms of those outcomes for students. So I'm excited to dive in a little bit there. But before we get into it, I think one of my favorite questions to ask folks who come on is, what was your educator journey? What brought you here? I wanted to be a second baseman for the Red Sox, when I was in second grade, not necessarily coming into education. So what brought you down this road?
Well, I grew up in Canada, so it would have been hockey, not baseball. But even though the Blue Jays are looking pretty good right now. So I thought I was going to be at university. Well, first I wanted to be a teacher, and then I studied English literature. I thought I'd be an English teacher. And then I had a chance to do my master's. And I thought, well, I might as well do that too. And I really loved literature. I just loved the whole, like the evolution of thought, the history of ideas. Then I went to the University of Toronto, and I thought I was going to do my doctorate in English. And I worked on, I did my comps and the whole deal for my doctorate in English. But then we had 2 kids in 1 year. And so one, like 363 days apart. And although I had funding from the university, it wasn't that much. And I thought, well, I really need to get a job. So I got a job teaching students with learning disabilities in community college. In fact, the first group I work with, my coordinator said, these are the worst students in the college. If you can do anything with any of these students, I'll consider it a success. So I didn't know what to do. I had no idea. I thought I was going to teach Shakespeare or the modern novel. Here I was teaching these kids with learning disabilities. Not just kids, there was a wide range of ages from up most of them were just out of high school, but and their reading levels were the Nelson-Denning test, which we used back then, couldn't even measure their reading level. They were below reading level. So I didn't know what to do. But we had a person there who was an expert in working with students with learning disabilities, Dee LaFrance. It's now Dee Golan. And Dee was my coach. And we didn't use that term, but she was there as a professional developer available for anybody who wanted help. So she coached me. That course ended up, all 10 students stayed in the course. They wrote a letter to the president to keep the course. The course got an award. I got a full-time job. And I think when you see students who've historically not succeed, you want to spread the word. So I ended up getting a special ed certification. Then I started to do professional development where I was training people in the learning strategies. Then I moved from Toronto to Kansas to do my doctorate. And initially we called the role an instructional, actually the first thing was a learning consultant. So back in 1996, we had a grant to focus on learning consultants. Then in 99, we got a lot of Gear Up funding and we focused on instructional collaborators. And I wrote an article on instructional collaborators and was accepted by the Journal of Staff Development. And when I got it back, I said, I think I'm going to change the name to instructional coach. That ended up being the first article on instructional coaching. A couple of years later, I wrote the book, Instructional Coaching, the first one with that word on the title. And it just kept evolving from then. So even though I passed my comps in English literature, I ended up doing my PhD in education. I had to do another set of comps. I spent 10 years in the Topeka School District. Well, first Lawrence School District, then Topeka School District, every day working with teachers and coaches. And we'd get together on Fridays and we keep refining our model. And that's where the book came from. And that's where the grounding for a lot of the work came from. Those 10 years we worked together in the Topeka School District.
I think it's an interesting story, right? I mean, you got prompted pretty hard with, 2 kids in 363 days to get into it. And it's opened up an entire world of that. And, one of the things I really admire about that story is I think it has matched a lot of the evolution of what we've seen since the mid 90s in terms of professional learning, the idea of instructional coaching, the professionalization, right, of the idea of like real serious support for educators in the classroom. I'm a late in life ed techer. I spent most of my career in finance and private equity, and I'll be the first one to tell you, and I've mentioned it here before, you have the benefit when you're growing up in finance of having significant coaching and support, and no one thinks twice about it, right? That, so if you're going to let someone, run a large company, they're going to want to make sure that you're fully qualified to get there. I think one of the questions I'd love to think about is, we've been through a pandemic. We have been through one-to-one in classrooms. We've seen the emergence of digital core, which was, supposed to be the savior of all things to everyone at every point. But PL in many respects has been going through a hard evolution, particularly post-COVID. How have you mapped or thought about this last decade? And, where do you think districts are getting it right? And where would you like to see improvement going forward? Or maybe another way to say it is, are we still getting some things fundamentally wrong about PD?
Well, if it's working, it's not wrong. So I'm hesitant to say you're doing it the wrong way, I think. But if it's not working, it's worthwhile stepping back and asking some questions. And sometimes, pretty frequently, it's not working. And I would say what we learned, those 10 years of work, and we've continued to study the book, Instructional Coaching, that came out in 2006. I wrote a book in 2021 called The Definitive Guide to Instructional Coaching. Just about everything in the 2006 books has changed except for the partnership principles. Pretty much everything else has changed. And I'm working on a new version of instructional coaching. That'll be an evolution too. So we are continually getting better, mostly about making a lot of mistakes. But one of the things we learned in that journey from the early 2000s, actually 98 on to, was that we thought our job was to show up and teach teachers how to do practices. I worked at the Center for Research on Learning. They're famous for KU was number one in special ed for a long, long time. It may still be number one. And the Center for Research on Learning was famous for evidence-based practices to help kids with learning disabilities. So we'd show up, we'd tell people, this has been evident. Here's the research to support it. Let me show you how to do it. You should do it the way I want to do it. And we just found we didn't get implementation. What we got was interest. People liked the ideas. They just didn't implement. And so what we learned is we were doing it all wrong. We were starting with a strategy, assuming everybody would take it and use it and implement it. So now what we do, and the whole way we do coaching, is to start with the kids. Let's analyze what the kids are doing and aren't doing. What kind of changes do we want to see? Then the coach selects the strategy. And we found when you do that, you get much greater level of sustained implementation. And the teacher's way motivated because they're involved right from the start. They're the ones who help identify what the kids need. They select the strategy in partnership with a coach. They make modifications. And what's compelling for a teacher when you see differences in kids' lives, you want to stick with it. And so when you start with the kids, then you pick the strategy, then you put it in, you're going to see a big difference in kids. And that leads to long-term sustained implementation and higher morale because teachers want to make a difference.
I love that take because, we've been thinking a lot at Better Lesson around what is it going to take for us to think about accountability to outcomes as maybe the core portion of the work that we do, right? And we'll talk about budget in a minute, but one of the things that I think is maybe helpfully come out of the last year's worth of swirl is some clarity around the things that matter most, right? And number one is when a kid walks across a graduation stage, that they are genuinely post-secondary ready to persist in a job, career, whatever those things may be. And we've talked about this before on this podcast. And if that's the case, then everything we do has to measure back to that actual preparedness and that outcome for a kid. And I think that, when we were in our prep call, we talked a little bit about the Gusky framework. And I think it's as relevant today, and maybe even more so than it was in 2000 when it was published, because I think it gets at the heart of what you're talking about. Did we put the behavioral shifts in place? Did we see the change behavior in the classroom? And then ultimately, did we measure different results for kids? And if we're failing at that last gate, right, then it really doesn't matter what we're doing, instructional coaching or otherwise in professional learning, because we're actually failing to capture the most important measure, right? Which is, are we seeing students with more positive outcomes? And, I think that simplification in our world around that particular point, even though it can be hard to measure at times, has to come to the forefront of what's effective and what's not.
Yeah, I don't think it's that hard to measure. I mean, we studied a long time about setting goals. We landed on this acronym called PEERS. I spent a day, my wife was driving up to Nebraska. I was sitting in the passenger side and I had my phone tethered. So I spent a day as we drove the 6-hour drive trying to find an acronym for the elements I wanted in PEERS. So I landed on PEERS and I went, that's good. I'm going to go with that. But the first two parts are that the goal is powerful and as easy as possible to reach. It's not going to be easy. You got a classroom full of kids. It's going to be difficult. And there's a book called Influencer where they study influence. And they said that the critical things in terms of implementation are two things. Is it worth it? Can I do it? And so the goal has to be worth it. That's the powerful part. You're going to have it unmistakably. It's going to leave a dent on kids, a positive impact on their lives, whether it's well-being or engagement or achievement, something that they'll be different in a positive way next year. And we've done everything we can to make it easy. And then it has to matter deeply to the teacher, emotionally compelling goal. And then you need to be able to measure it. There has to be a measurable outcome. That's why I wrote the book, Data Rules, is to lay out, here's how you measure engagement, here's how you measure achievement. But there also has to be a strategy to take you there. And so we say you need an instructional playbook or at least some set of powerful strategies to help the person get there. We're pretty agnostic. I mean, I wrote a book on instruction called High Impact Instruction, but there's lots of great books. I really like Brian Goodwin's work. I like John Hattie's work. I think it's just not going to be guaranteed to work in every situation. You have to figure out what do the kids need and then pick and choose. But over time, you create this playbook. These are our go-to strategies. And then those goals are student-focused goals, not teacher-focused goals. So the student-focused goal is I want the kids to be able to write a well-organized paragraph according to this criteria. I want the kids to feel safe talking in my classroom. I want the kids to be engaged during the lesson, and we're going to study engagement through experience sampling or whatever it might be. So that I would say you can get really clear on what the goal is, and that's a really, really important thing. My good friend John Campbell, he's a really great friend of mine. He worked with another guy, Tony Wagner, and Tony Wagner's quote was, "If there's no goal, it's just a nice conversation." And the goal needs to be one that's worth it, and it needs to be accessible, doable, student focused is what we've learned.
And that reframe into the world of student focused, I think, matters a lot because, we have to keep the focus of our system on the constituent we're trying to promote, right? Which is our students having the ability to graduate with options and choice and having had a positive impact for the decisions that we make. Um, one of the things I think is also interesting here is our ability to do some of this at scale, whether it's remote coaching, using AI for analysis of classroom behavior or differentiation, right? Like there's a whole host of new tools that are coming or have come that will also help us think about how we reach those student outcomes. We really measure and understand what's happening. How do you look at something like coaching, which is inherently a human interaction, but also look at like AI tools and others and think about scale for the future? Because it's expensive. I mean, and like we can all talk about the importance of one-to-one coaching. We know that it's incredibly important for helping to embed behavior and personalized instruction. And at the same time, are there ways we can think about using technology for greater scale?
The first thing I'd say was what's really expensive is whole school professional development that decreases morale that nobody learns from. I mean, that's an expense. So when you start looking at the cost, there's actually a paper that my son did. He's a researcher at University of Washington, and he studies economics and professional learning and education, where he looked at the cost effectiveness of professional development. So it's been studied, but when it comes to AI, it's a machine right now. I mean, maybe general artificial intelligence will change things, if it's ever possible to create that, but it has strengths, it has limitations. It's a tool, but it's not an adaptive tool in the way that the human brain is adaptive. And so that means, when we go through a coaching cycle, we get clear on where we are, we got clear on where we want to get to, then we figure out how we're going to get there, then we help the teacher get ready to implement, and they implement and it doesn't work. And so then we have to make modifications and adaptations until we hit that goal, that powerful, emotionally compelling goal. What AI is, it's like a vending machine for ideas. You can say, I've got this issue. It'll tell you something, but it may not give you the right thing. It might even lie about it and make it up, but it's going to help you. There's things you can do. You can take a transcript of a lesson, load it into whatever thing you use. It can give you it can break down the questions you asked. It can tell you how much time the teacher talked, how much time the student talked. It could talk about explanations. There are many things you can use, but as I can see it, those who would advocate that AI could replace coaching don't understand coaching, because coaching is an adaptive human process where you have to make modifications along the way. The two people have to think it through. And what AI does is it gives you an answer. So it'll give you a thing. So if you said, I've got these problems, it'll say, well, why don't you try these strategies? But the strategies may or may not be the right thing. So there's a thing called technocentrism, technosolutionism. There's a different techno. Technosolutionism is where you think just because the machine said it, it must be true, but it says a lot of things that aren't true. We believe in it. I'm writing a book on AI and coaching to come out early next year. We have courses at the Instructional Coaching Group on AI and coaching. We think it can accelerate what happens, but a lot of what happens it's not at a point right now, the technology where it can do those adaptive modifications that a human being needs to do. A really good coach helps you think through the problem. Like, let's say the kids I'll give you a little example. One of our coaches from years ago, Michelle Harris, who's now struck out on her own and she's doing great things. She had a teacher, and she watched the video of her class, the teacher, and the teacher realized that all the kids who were multilingual weren't answering any questions. So you had a whole bunch of kids who could speak Spanish really well, but in her class, they weren't very good at English. She said, those kids have to speak up in class, because if they don't start speaking up, they'll be less and less engaged. By the time they're 16, they're going to drop out. I need to get those kids engaged. Until she saw the video, she didn't realize that was a problem. So they said, okay, well, let's do talking tokens. Spencer Kagan, I think, is the one who came up with the idea. We'll give each kid tokens. And the teacher said, I have a bunch of dominoes. Another teacher left here. Let's use those. So they gave every kid 3 dominoes and seventh grade. And she said, now, when you talk, I want you to take your dominoes and put them in the middle of the table to show that you've been speaking, because I want everybody to speak. The goal was something like 70% of the kids would speak up all the time, or kids would speak up 70% of the time, something to do with 70%. Anyway, they're 7th graders. You give them a bunch of dominoes. What do you suppose they did? They played dominoes. It didn't do any good. It made things worse. So then Michelle said, well, let's try something else. And then they tried think, pair, share. And then they thought carefully about which kids to pair together. And they had, but what AI would do is say, do think, pair, share. Here's a checklist. It might not be able to recognize, first off, it might not notice what the teacher noticed if you just used the video to analyze it, which was that the multilingual kids weren't learning. It might notice that, it might not. So you need the human element within the whole process to make sure that you get the, otherwise you could be going down the wrong road with a lot of enthusiasm and end up no further ahead. And then the last thing is just that, I don't think it's a calculator. I don't see how artificial compassion can beat human compassion. I just don't know how you can feel there's mutual disclosure when you're disclosing to a machine. So I think there's a huge human element that's not there too. But does it have potential? Is it going to keep getting better? Yes, 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 absolutely. We have to use it in the right way.
It's funny. I think it comes down to one of the pieces that I think you highlighted early on there that I think really matters is we need to stop always thinking about things as binaries, right? Like either we're using AI or we're using human touch, right? The reality is, I remember having this conversation with a friend, and we were talking about using machine learning for differentiation, right? And the point was not to insult a teacher to say, hey, you don't have the ability to differentiate for your students. The question was, are you able to use a million stories of kids who are in similar situations and understand the variety of outcomes that might have been tested? And are you better off being able to look at that much larger, statistically significant set of outcomes as opposed to your own experience, and use those two to supplement together, right? To say, hey, here's some options or things I might try or things I may not have ever thought of, right? And we can use things like AI and machine learning to help analyze these large data sets and make things grokkable that, for a single person getting ready to differentiate for their classroom tomorrow don't work. But again, it's working together to use the technology as a tool in support of the work, in support of the human work that's going on, as opposed to an alternative to that human work.
Yeah, I actually just talked about this very thing with Carol Tomlinson last week. And the fear there is that techno-solutionism, the idea that we can go to the vending machine, push a button, and out comes a solution. It has to involve, there's a lot that has to be learned to differentiate effectively. You have to have a meaningful curriculum. You have to do, sort of got 5 key areas, and that idea you can push a button and get an answer isn't probably going to cut it. But if you can identify, if the prompt is a really good prompt and you can identify the key things, it can be really helpful.
I love the idea of us, instead of, I've made the joke here that we have a choice between, Skynet and Star Trek, right? And I tend to take the more Star Trek vision of, we can use technology to open up new doors and opportunities for us to work together and maybe accentuate what makes us human even more, by helping us cut through some of the noise and the support. And I think that it's also an intent question. And I think that highlights that intent piece. When you think about that investment, we're talking about, teachers and leaders and the importance of getting coaching and implementing change. I know we talk a lot about professional learning for the classroom educator. And I think you very, very importantly pointed out, sometimes we get into these very painful cycles of, we bring everyone together, we throw them into a large auditorium, we do some sort of weird edutainment thing, and then we hope it all gets better. That's not really investing in long-term change. I think one of the things that we've thought about a lot here at BL is, what does it mean to pair work with leaders and helping them become better instructional leaders in the building, alongside of the work that we do with classroom educators to help them implement better in the classroom. You talk a little bit about, those two constituents, whether it's the leaders that you're coaching to be those instructional leaders or working with teachers and how you can pair those pieces for more effectiveness. Because we find when we can talk to both constituents, you end up getting to a better place because everyone feels bought in across the system as opposed to something that's being handed to one person to do.
Yeah, well, I think there are certain things that are just going to be critical for professional learning to succeed. At least that's what we found in our work. I think the bottom line is if the kids are improving, you don't worry about it. But for example, there's the human element, the beliefs that drive your work. Do you believe in the people you work with? Do you work from a partnership perspective or a top down? I'm going to tell you what you do. Really, do you see teachers as professionals or not? People who can make their own decisions. And then there's the way you communicate, particularly the way you listen and share ideas, the way you ask questions, and then how you lead yourself and how you lead others. Am I a multiplier? Am I a diminisher? Do I balance ambition with humility? So that's the who I am part for any leader, whether you were talking about a coach or an instructional coach, those key elements are there. But the second part, for a focus on instruction, you probably need some kind of conversational framework, some way to talk about the practices to identify the goals. We call that the impact cycle. There could be other ways of doing it. But then you need to be able to measure goals. So you need to understand data and you need to understand, okay, once we set the goal and we know the data to measure progress, we need to understand teaching practices. And what I see quite often, I don't mean this as a criticism, everybody's intent is really, really, everybody in education, if they're here still, they want to make a difference. But they don't know the practices they're sharing very well. And so there has to be a real depth of knowledge. And so we say by constructing an instructional playbook where I've been talking about this for 15 years, but where you break down, here are our highest leverage practices. And here's a checklist to describe it. And here's a one-pager to describe what the research says and why we use it. And then let's get together and we'll talk about it. We'll modify it to make once you've set the goal, we'll pick from the playbook. You may not go from the playbook. It could be something else, but the playbook is a starting point. And that playbook should be filled with evidence-based practices, but their most important evidence is that it works with the kids in your school. And not too many things. If you have a playbook with 100 strategies, it's, I don't know how you can have that depth, like 15 to 20 things that you say, these are our best bets in having a big impact on kids. So I would say for leaders to learn a coaching approach to leading, that's really the first part. I think taking a coaching approach as a leader is maybe the most important leadership skill, to be able to, as Sir John Whitmore said, unleash the potential of other people by the way you ask questions, the way you communicate that you believe in people, the way you listen, and the way you move the conversation forward. And at the same time, you have to have expertise. You have expertise, you just don't act like an expert. And without the expertise, there's a real danger you'll be talking at a conceptual level that doesn't have any impact. But if you set a real goal and you can really describe a strategy and the teacher gets it and they take it and they run with it, then good things can happen.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And we talk about connecting to the outcomes for kids, right? That point of connection and that coaching mindset as a leader bleeds into the mindset of the classroom educator you're working with, right? That level of collaboration and spirit. And I think one of the things that we have found is when we do those together and we focus on that collaborative spirit at the leader level, it creates an environment for that try, measure, learn, that willingness to be vulnerable. And to your point, for us to be able to have open conversations about what's happening with our students and adjusting that framework along the way to ensure that we're maximizing that impact. Because at the end of the day, like, we can talk about everything we want to do. We can buy the most expensive PL. We can put the best systems in place. If it doesn't do anything for the students that we're trying to impact, none of it mattered in the first place.
No.
And so much of that collaborative environment is critical to getting people comfortable enough to make the adjustments necessary to meet where their kids are.
Yeah, that's why our catchphrase that we use, we have a big conference every year called TLC. And our catchphrase is keep kids first. But that means that's where we start. And then ultimately, that's how we measure our impact. But not only that, though, what motivates teachers, Michael Fullan's been on about this in multiple books, is making a difference in the lives of kids. When you have a teacher teachers who are really transforming kids' lives are not ones who are thinking about dropping out. Ones who are thinking about dropping out are ones who are dropping out from teaching are ones who are thinking, I don't think I'm making any difference. So helping the teacher set the goal and accomplish the goal is highly motivating. People want to make a difference.
And, listen, count me on the let's pay teachers more. It's a really hard job. We're asking them to do something critical. But I think you also points to the fact that people are leaving the classroom not overpay. They're leaving because they feel like they're failing. And it becomes a very normal human choice to say, hey, if I don't think I can do it here, I'll find another way, particularly for impact motivated folks. And, I like the idea of saying, much of teacher retention actually comes down to I've dedicated a large part of my life to helping kids. Am I actually seeing those kids that I'm trying to help succeed and thrive in the classroom that I'm creating for them?
Yep. Yep. I agree completely.
The last thing I want to bring up is it feels like we're headed into a world of tighter budgets, demonstrable ROI, school districts, school boards asking for what'd you spend the money on? How can you prove that it mattered? And we saw all of Title II get held for a period of time this summer, which we know was a kind of a rough hit on PD in particular. It feels like we're always so quick to cut PD, yet when we're getting to the things that matter for student outcomes, that alignment that we're able to get for the adults in the classroom should be one of the very first things that we measure. For those who are struggling or thinking about how do I manage these hard decisions with more limited resources? How do I make sure I'm there supporting, as a leader, for instance, supporting my classroom educators? What would you recommend they start thinking about in terms of PD and impact, particularly when a world feels a little tighter than it used to?
I think you have to draw a direct line between what the coach does and the outcomes that are accomplished. There can't be any ambiguity about did the coach make an impact. And so that means there's many things you can do, but the most important one is probably to document really clearly what are the goals that were set and what were hit. That's why data is so important. Helping teachers become, I don't know what the word is. I don't know if you can be numerate about, not literate about, and I guess you could use numerate, but the coaches really need to understand data. They need to document their goals in ways that people recognize as reliable. And then when you go to the decision makers, you can say, here are the things the coaches did. If you're going to cut the goal, these growth things are things you're cutting. And I think coaches who aren't making a difference in the lives of kids in a measurable way are going to have a hard time selling what they're doing. And if they're not changing the lives of kids, I think the school district's right to say that's an investment that's not making a difference. But done well, coaching. And the thing about coaching is it's not just this year's students. It's every student that teacher teaches for the rest of this teacher's life. So you're having a massive impact when you're a kid. Or when you're a coach, it doesn't necessarily show up as dramatically in 1 year, but in 1 year, it still needs to be really clear. So documenting in very specific ways the goals that have been set, the goals that have been hit. So you can say the kids were at this level, now they're at this level. It's because of the coach. There has to be a direct line between the coach's actions and the out that comes. We have a book called Evaluating Instructional Coaching, but in essence, it's about evaluating coaches as well as the program. But the key thing for the program is there's a direct line between what the coach does and what the outcome is.
Before I came to Better Lesson, I was with a digital core curriculum company called LearnZillion, right? And we were, right at the Ed Reports heyday and getting into green rated curricula. And I remember there was a bit of it was a tough moment in the world of curriculum as we saw what were popular pieces being deemed, kind of red or yellow rated, seeing some of the OER materials. But now here we are 10 years later, and it has really lifted the boat for everybody by putting those accountability standards out there. And I think that when I came into PD, 4 or 5 years ago, I'm excited to hear the conversation you're having. I think we're trying to have the same one too, which is we cannot be afraid of putting our work against the measurement of what's happening for kids. And the moment someone tells you, oh, it's just about teacher NPS scores or satisfaction, and it doesn't then translate into, and also we saw this uplift for our kids, I think we're having half a conversation. And I really appreciate you hammering that point home, because I think that as an industry, we owe it to show that ROI for our kids for the investment we're making.
Yep. But it's easy to do too. I mean, once you learn what to do, And that's the data rules. That's that's the whole thing we do is we get really clear on the goal so that we can and get clear on how to hit those goals. What's the pathway to the goal? And, there's a research on hope. Shane Lopez was a researcher who's kind of a friend of mine at the University of Kansas. He worked with a guy named Rick Snyder. They have a whole approach called hope theory, and hope involves three things: something to hope for, a pathway to the goal, and a belief that the goal is going to get there. So I could say, I want to play goalie for the Boston Bruins.
Good luck, Mr. Swayman. It's tough
Well,
times.
I'm a Leaf fan, so that's why I picked them. But anyway, there's no pathway that would ever take me there. So I don't have any hope for that. But if I said I want to run a 5K in under 40 minutes, I can see a pathway to that. And so hope involves those three things. Coaches bring hope because what coaches do is they help the teacher get clear on where they want to get to. They help them identify the pathway. And then by gathering data on progress, they build agency because they can show this thing you're doing is working. Those three things, I think it applies to kids and adults. Do I know what I'm hoping for? Do I have a pathway? And do I believe the pathway will take me there? And that's what coaches do. They build hope by putting those three things in place.
I appreciate that. And I think that is the right place for us to go. Speaking of hope, we talked about your journey to an educator. What's keeping you hopeful these days, looking forward?
Well, hope's the better option, and what? First off, challenge isn't necessarily, now I haven't lived through the kind of horrors some people live through. I've lost family members and had hard times, went through a divorce, but some people go through really, really horrible things. But I think one thing is, and this Nietzsche wrote about this, but it's that to embrace challenges not necessarily as a bad thing, but actually as a learning opportunity, as a gift. So even when you're in a struggling situation, it's really about what can I learn from this challenge? And that shift in my mind, which really happened within the last year, has been really helpful because then whatever I'm doing, dealing with someone who's not hearing me, misunderstanding what I'm saying, acknowledging my own weaknesses in a particular my failures in a particular circumstance, or dealing with funding cuts or whatever it might be, personnel issues or difficult relationships, or all the different things people deal with, to see it as a gift to learn from rather than, and I always say it's like sports. You have some quarterbacks who've got 90 seconds left and they're going to say, okay, we can still win this game. Let's go. And you got some quarterbacks who'll say, the referee has been terrible this whole game. Do you want to be the one who's a winner, or do you want to be the one who's a loser? And I think saying, I acknowledge there are some things so horrible, it doesn't fit into this model. But the kind of day-to-day things we deal with, to say this challenge I'm facing, maybe there's something here I can learn. And maybe on the other, and what the author I read says about this, he says, when you look back on life, the things you remember are often those difficult things you move through, and you came out on the other end better for it. So that's kind of how I see it.
And you know what? I think that the kids who sit in our classrooms deserve us. They deserve people who are going to want to help them, who are going to choose hope as the right outcome, because that is an investment in them as well.
Yeah.
All right. Well, listen, Jim Knight, this is a fantastic conversation. So appreciative to have you on here, and thankful to our audience for tuning in for another episode of Lessons Learned. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to share. You can find more episodes on podcast.betterlesson.com. Thank you so much for the time.
Thanks, man. You take care.
That wraps another episode of the Lessons Learned podcast. Thank you for listening. For show notes and more about Better Lesson, please visit betterlesson.com/podcast. Lessons Learned is hosted by Better Lesson, the leading provider of data-driven, high-impact, system-wide K-12 teaching and learning solutions. We partner with states and districts to support every educator in developing the next generation of resourceful, compassionate, and resilient learners who are college and career ready. Our work has impacted more than 80,000 educators and nearly 3 million students nationwide. See you in the next episode.